Hi, hope you're keeping safe. Sit back and relax. 40 minutes of building my Butsudan. Hi, I'm Mitch. Welcome to my workshop where I've just completed my latest commission which is about to go out the door. It's this Butsudan, not sure the pronunciation, but it's used by Buddhists as part of a shrine, and it's a lovely little cabinet. So let me talk you through it and then I can tell you about the series that I'm going to be doing on it. So what we have is a carcass with a back in it, obviously. It's got a base and a sub base, and it's got an applied top on it. Twin doors, overlay doors, and the carcass is quite narrow. And you can see I've used through dovetail joints here, but they're also mitered dovetails. So if we look inside the case itself, you can see we have a mitre in the corner. The applied top, base and sub base have all got a round over with a quirk profile on them, and where the doors close you'll see that we've got a couple of little sprung buttons that just apply a little bit of friction on the bottom of the doors to stop them blowing in the breeze. I made a couple of custom oak handles for it, and to go with those there's a custom shaped hook in the top of the cabinet. Because it's oak, I've used all brass hardware so we don't get any staining issues. The base is attached with brass screws to allow access to the sprung door latches. It's got lovely proportions, and actually I was thinking that I might be making another one to hold my spoke shaves. So my client sent me some pictures of the sort of thing she was after, and I did some preliminary sketches, worked out some of the material requirements for them and some prices, and then stuck it on the computer, made some drawings up of the sort of idea that I had, and gave some options for handles and detailing of the base and the top. It's very handy that you can render very quickly some 3D images and let them see what it is you've got in your mind to see whether it matches what they've got in their mind. And when she decided that she was happy, then I could think about getting the wood. The client's requested a relatively plain European oak for her Butsudan, and I've just gone through and looked at what I had indoors, acclimated and ready to work on, and there wasn't enough. Unfortunately at the moment I'm suffering with my back and I can't drive more than about 5 minutes without being in agony, so I've had to order some online, and I received a couple of boards, and well, you can see this is got some pippy oak in there, which is not great for this particular project. This was the second board, which is a little better, and I managed, cutting from this one and from the other one and from what I already had in the house, to be able to get enough stock. Ordinarily I'd go to a timber yard and select all the material I wanted, bring it home and acclimate it for a few months before working on it. But this was a project that I could get done quickly, mostly with what I had in stock, and just buying another couple of pieces. But it does show you that when you buy online you don't always get what you're expecting, and there's some nice wood in here that I'll be able to use for other projects if people want something with a bit more character in it. Now, a major reason for keeping the boards indoors as I do is so that we can keep the moisture content at a good working level. That's about 8.7. Now the wood that I've actually bought in is kiln dried, and it's reading 7.9% moisture content. so that's a little bit lower. I'll get them sitting together. I'll mix the pieces, sort of sandwich them between each other with some sticks in there, and leave it for about a week before I do any work on it, and hopefully they'll come a little bit closer together. Breaking the boards down with hand saws was really easy, although I did take my time because of my back. Plugged-in woodworkers might like to use a jigsaw, circular saw, bandsaw or table saw. After a suitable rest for myself and the components, I set about squaring them all round, starting off by flattening, and as you can see here I'm using my business card technique just to take a slight bow out of the boards. Each face side deserves a face edge, and I prepare that whilst also smoothing. Plugged-in woodworkers could use a jointer to flatten and prepare a face side and face edge, but in my experience there's nothing that beats a hand plane for a smooth finish. Bringing to thickness and width is a piece of cake, and dare I even say pleasurable with the number 8. Plugged-in users, you can go to your thicknesser. With one end shot square, we can measure for, mark, saw and shoot the other end to length. So first of all I need to plough a groove near the back of each of the 4 case components on the inside to hold the back in place. I'm going to use a plough plane, so I'm set up with a cutter of the right width. I'm just setting the fence to put the groove in the right place, and I've set my depth stop, as you can see, for about 7mm. Plugged-in woodworkers might like to use a router with a guide fence or in a router table, or perhaps a table saw with a dado blade. And here I'm just checking how accurate I was with setting the fence up, but to be honest, because I'm going to be using the same setting on every part, the grooves will line up anyway. With a sample of the back fitting perfectly in the groove, I can go on to complete the other 3 components of the case. I'm pretty sure I managed to plough these grooves faster than if I'd tried to set up a router or a table saw, and it was certainly a lot quieter and there was a lot less dust around. I'm going to join these 2 boards together in the corner with a mitered dovetail. So we're going to end up having what looks like a mitre there, but that only extends back a little way, and we've got dovetails for the rest of the joint. So first of all I want to set my marking gauge to the thickness of this board and mark it around this one, but we'll leave the edges where we're not going to be cutting. Of course this will be the tail board, so we'll be cutting away where the dovetails come through the back, but at the front it's going to be a mitre. So down this side I'll just do a light line. I designed the layout for my dovetails so that the groove I put through the boards won't show through the side of the case. I'm just marking it out, marking out the tail board at the moment. Now I just square those marks across the end of the board and grab my dovetail marking gauge. Going for a slant of 1 in 8. Notice how the area to be mitered on the left hand side there is squared down rather than receiving a slope. You'll also see that I've transferred those marks round to the opposite side, and in this case I've got a groove in there which falls exactly where one of the tails is. There's going to be a secondary top on here, so we won't see where that comes through when the joint's put together. Now I can also mark in the miter line. By clamping the two tail boards together, I can simply copy my cut from one to the other. Then it's a case of removing all the waste, or the bulk of the waste, by sawing, and then cleaning up nicely with a sharp chisel. And last but not least, sawing and cleaning up the miter. So the first task today is to copy the layout of all my tails onto my pin boards. If you want more details, check out the dovetail episodes in my hand cut joints series, where I'll explain everything that I'm doing. But basically we're just using a scalpel here to mark out the tails onto the pin board so we know where to cut. And I'll mark it in with pencil so it's clearer for you to see. These lines will tell me how deep I need to cut, and then I'll just pencil in all the waste so I don't make any silly mistakes. Mustn't forget the miter for the corners. I find sawing away most of the waste is a lot quicker than chopping in this hard oak, and it also saves the edges on my chisels. Fully hand cut dovetails aren't of course to everybody's liking. You can do an awful lot of the waste removal with a table saw or a bandsaw. And of course on the market there are a lot of jigs to use with a router. Many different types, here's just a few of them. They will do a reasonable job, but some are limited in the types of joints they can produce. And for actually the mitre through dovetail that I've used on this case, I'm not sure that any of these can do it in one go, but I'm sure they could do most of the joint and then there'd just be a little bit of handwork to finish it off. Now a couple of my saw cuts missed the knife line very slightly. This oak's so hard that it won't compress, so I'll just have to pare back to those lines. And actually the pencil makes it look worse because it's so thick. So pare back to the knife lines and it should go together on the first try. Somehow I forgot to finish off one of the tailboards. So here's just finishing the back edge of it. The back edge doesn't get a mitre, that's only on the front. And with that done, I can continue doing the pins for the other three corners. After a successful dry fit and planning how I was going to clamp it, it was time to glue it up. Now you can see I'm just slipping in the back, and I cut that from some oak veneered MDF, which will be lovely and stable in there. There's a lot of glue surfaces here to get glued up, so I'm using an extended set glue. This means I can take my time and have a more relaxed approach to it. Finally, a quick check to make sure the case is nice and square, and then I can leave it overnight to cure. So the first job was to flush the face of the case, and I must apologise for the background noise. I obviously had Radio 4 on and completely forgot about it. So I'm just using my smoother here to go around the face of the case to flush off all the mitres in the mitered dovetail joints. Clearly the planing direction of each of your components will determine how you transition from one to the other. There's almost always some final flushing up of the pins and tails, just paying attention to the grain directions so we don't get any tear out or break out, and just testing with some white spirits to check for any glue that's perhaps still in the pores or areas where we haven't touched with the smoother, and just tackling those with card scraper. For plugged-in woodworkers, I suppose you could use a sander for this, but I really can't think why you'd want to. Then a single shaving bevel removes the sharp, fragile edges. I could actually get the handles out of this small section of oak, but actually working the curves on them, the shaping of them, would be very difficult on a piece like this. So what I've done is clamped a wider section here on my bench, like so, and that just allows me to, well, first of all, hold it nicely. I've got it between dogs. I've got it off the edge of the bench, so I can use this face as a reference, and I'm going to be using my 45 combination plane. I've got a fluting bit in there which will give me the two inside curves, and I can work just off the side like so. And when I've completed the shaping of the two sides and the front edge, I can then saw it off this main piece. You'll see in a moment that I actually create two pulls back to back in this one piece. Now, with the rear curves of the hand, both handles made, I can then take down this centre section to the same level, and then I could slice the handles off through the middle. I saw and planed the waste off to reveal what will be the front of the second pull. Now I can add some guidelines to help me round off the front of both of the pulls. For any plugged-in woodworkers out there, try using a router with a combination of straight cutting bit, a cove cutting bit and a round over bit. This first cut is to produce what will become a hook inside the cabinet. And here I'm just cutting the pulls to actual length. And finally I can cut down the centre to produce a pull for the left door and the right door. I've sawn and planed the piece for the top and the two pieces that make up the applied base, and I'm just smoothing them off with a plane, card scraper and cabinet scraper, and it was actually quite a tricky piece of wood, this one. Ready to apply the shaping to the edges and the moulding around the edges. Most of this surface won't get seen again, but that's no excuse for missing a couple of minutes of making it look nice. Now, using a pair of compasses, I can lay out the centre point for the rounded corner. There's a small radius for the applied top and for the upper of the two bottom pieces, and the lower of the two bottom pieces gets a larger radius. I'm using a coping saw to cut away most of the waste at the corners. Plugged in woodworkers might like to use a bandsaw, jigsaw, or maybe a router with a template. I perfect the curve using my levelling beam with different grits of sandpaper, whereas plugged in woodworkers might like to use a sanding station. With all the corners perfected, I can then scribe in the line which will define the edge of the quirk. That's the little square section above the round over. Now I can cut the rebate, which will end up being the quirk, using a rebate plane for the straight edges and chisels just around the corner. The vast majority of the rounding over
Free plans can be found by clicking on the link in the top right hand corner or following the link in the description below.
To perfect the round over and to ensure that it's even on all the pieces, I'm just going to create a little scratch stock, or actually a scratch card it will be. Just flatten off one of the corners and fire a little divot into it so I can start a round file. Plugged in woodworkers, well, just grab your router and get yourself an overload cutter. You can see I've also allowed for the quirk. I'll just clean it off finally with a diamond file. Just gets the edges nice and sharp. As you can see, it really is a piece of cake to use, and it won't need much sanding to clean up after I've done all the edges. And these profiled sanding blocks are excellent for just getting into that quirk there and making a good job of it. So I started by cutting my doors to length, and as with all other surfaces in the project, I smoothed that off and just finishing off here with a card scraper, so there'll be very limited finishing later on. I'm just shooting the ends nice and square, get to exactly the right height for the doors, and left the width slightly thick
and I'll trim that down with the plane once I've fitted the doors with the hinges. And here I am actually finishing off the width to about a 0.5 millimetre thicker than it wants to be, or wider than it wants to be. Now to mark out for the hinges, I screw on the hinge in the position I want it, and to do that you want to flip the back of the hinge back past about 270 degrees so it touches the side of the cabinet, and push it up against the cabinet, and then mark for the holes. Put a couple of steel screws in. Don't want to use the brass ones yet because they'll probably break off the first time you put the threads through. And then just use a marking knife to mark carefully around the edges of where we need to mortise. And you see with these T hinges we also have to mark on the butt side, because the butt's much shorter than the actual flange. And I'll just cut in next to where the butt goes with a dovetail saw down to depth, and then it becomes a case of chopping with a chisel. And actually I'll change the width of the chisel to do the central section because that's wider. And then we can carefully remove all the waste material, pairing from where the hinge butt goes. But also I'm finding this very brittle, so I start off just cutting some knife walls in on the inside edge, and I'll work to those then. With something as brittle as this oak is, it's very hard as well. You have to press quite hard to do anything, and then suddenly it'll let go. So if I just clean up on that knife wall first, it'll help preserve the far edge if anything goes wrong. And then it's just working down to the right depth. Taking my time, and obviously these ends, because they're narrow, it's a bit like making a standard mortise really. You just take a little bit at a time, but the depth is not very great, so it's all pairing rather than mortise chisel out and lots of hammering. And then bring out the router plane just to get a nice flat bottom to the mortise. Power users might want to use a router for this, but I'm only doing 4 hinges, so it's not going to take me that long. You should end up with a nice snug fit and nice and flush. Now this is a bit of reconstruction because I've either didn't film or I can't find at least the footage for it. Just drilling holes in the doors to take the door pulls. And so it was extremely hard. Actually I probably should have used pillar drill rather than twist drill that I did use, but I wanted to keep it all handwork, so I persevered. These twin flute bits are pretty good actually. They remove the waste quite quickly. So then it's brass screws for the door pulls. And I've I don't know if I showed it in the video, but I pre-drilled the door pulls so I can go straight in with the brass screw, nice and easy. Had I been doing the final finish on this Butsudan, then I would probably have fitted these door pulls with dowels so that the inside of the door remained completely flush. But as the client's doing the finishing, if I apply them with screws, then she can remove them to get a much better finish. After I finished applying the door pulls, I fitted the doors to the cabinet, and with them attached I actually planed where they meet together in the middle for a nice thin consistent gap. There's no video from the actual Butsudan build, so I'm just making a sample here. So if you're doing it by hand, I'll take a 1/2 inch dowel, drive it through a 12mm dowel plate, which cleans it up nicely because they never come particularly nice in the first place. I create a nice square end on there, then find the centre and drill a hole to take the spring. And you'll see I do line the drill up eventually when we actually get it started. And at the other end I've found centre, and I'm drawing around the circle, which is going to be the size of the actual latch button that comes through the top surface. And then I'm cutting down to that depth all the way round, halfway down the cylinder. So you can see I've got the hole at the bottom, cut round, and I'll just pare away back to my circle. And it's actually very easy if you stick it in the dowel plate. I'll just put a piece of plywood over there to protect the rest of it, and I can pare down and scrape up to get a nice circle. And I actually finish off by going back to the dowel plate and driving it through, or pushing it through, turning it through the 6mm hole. And that's the hand tool method. Want to use some power, then we'll do it on the lathe. I'm making 2 this time, using a skew chisel just to clean off the dowel. I think maybe I should be making some pens. Now I've been doing some practice on this. And I'll take that down to a fraction under 12mm. And I want to cut in, as I'm making 2, I'll cut in the shoulders for the actual buttons themselves. And on this one I'm doing it to about 8mm. Just got to work with the drill sizes you've got, because obviously these buttons have got to pass through a hole with a little bit of slack so that they move freely. So this will end up being 2 buttons. Now I'm centre drilling and full drilling through for the springs at both ends. This is the other end now, I've switched it round. And then I'll just clean off the part of the dowel that was being held by the lathe dog. And then parting off near the middle. Obviously I didn't measure it, and watch out, I went a bit too far. So this is a sample block I'm going to put the button in. I drill through with a 12mm drill, part the way through. So that takes a sloppy fit with the main part, and then a through hole for the actual button part to go through. And again, sloppy enough for it to move freely. Now I'll take a spring from a pen. Actually I only need about half a spring for this size. And in the Butsudan you've got a solid bottom which supports the bottom of the spring, but if you've just got a single board, then I find it's good to recess and glue in a coin, which also gives you a date reference for when you made it. On the Butsudan, a slight chamfer on the back of the door at the bottom easily pushes down the rounded top of the button, and friction holds it from opening. Look after yourselves and don't forget to subscribe to see videos every day during the COVID-19 problems.